Hey there.
Hey
I
there.
love the shirt. I
Thank
love
you.
the shirt. So what you guys don't know is right before we came out here, I was actually blowing things up and playing ping pong and like using some weird laser gun, and that was all part of like the latest demo of Oculus, which was fascinating. So can you just describe to them what you just showed me, like the latest prototype?
Sure. What we were showing you was Oculus Toy Box, which actually wasn't designed as a game. It was designed as a technology test bed that we use to develop new types of interactions, new types of controller technology. And we have a lot of different things you can do in it. You can light fireworks, shoot guns, throw boomerangs, just do a lot of things that require fine precision interaction that you haven't been able to do with other technologies. And it is a networked experience, so you can have multiple people in this virtual space with avatars that represent them, feeling like they're actually in a virtual space together, even though they're actually in different places. In this case, you were just in a room a few feet away, but that room could have been 100 miles away or 1,000 miles away.
And you could hear him, and he was like, "No, pick that up. You're doing that wrong." It was interesting. So when we kind of take a step back and look at virtual reality, talk to me about let's look at the top 5 use cases that you think are going to be relevant. And you know what? I'll make it easy on you. I'm going to take out gaming and pornography. So give me 3 other use cases. I'm not going to ask you directly about porn right now. 3 really interesting use cases of the future for Oculus.
It's really tough to come up with exactly what the best uses are going to be. It's going to take time to see what really evolves, but we're already starting to see people use virtual reality for storytelling, much like Hollywood. I think that there's a lot of promise for virtual reality in the education industry. There's also people using it for medical simulation, for first responder training. Really anything that you can do in the real world can be done a lot more safely and a lot more cost effectively in virtual reality. And that's going to be more and more true as virtual reality gets better in quality and the price comes down.
And I mean, let's talk like education. Let's go into a classroom. What does this look like with Oculus?
Well, let's not go into a classroom because classrooms are broken. Kids don't learn best by reading books. I'm generalizing, I know. Like some people that really is the best way to learn, and for some topics it is. But there's clearly value in real world experience and actually going to do things. That's why we have field trips. That's why we send kids places like museums and even to foreign countries when we can. The problem is that the majority of people will never be able to do the majority of those experiences. It's one thing to have a bunch of kids in DC that are able to go to the Smithsonian for their field trips, but what do you do about the kids who are growing up in Kentucky, the kids who are growing up in Ohio, the people who are growing up in countries around the world where they can't just go down the street and experience these amazing things? Virtual reality has the potential to make those experiences available to everyone, not just things that exist in real life, but things that you can't do in real life, like seeing molecular structure or chemical reactions on a different scale, or being able to visit historical recreations of things that don't even exist anymore. In those types of scenarios, I think virtual reality has the potential to help people learn in much more real ways and to see things and understand things in a way they would never get from just watching a video or reading a book.
You know, it seems like we keep hearing these like fascinating use cases for what the world's going to look like with virtual reality, but it just hasn't gone mainstream. So at what point, and I know we've been talking about this for decades, like at what point is this mainstream, or will it always be a little bit niche?
I mean, it's almost certainly going to be mainstream at some point. It's a matter of time, quality, and cost. There's kind of this misconception over the last few years that virtual reality is a gaming technology, and that's actually a pretty new conception, a new thing that people have been thinking. If you look back at virtual reality over the decades, in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it was not about gaming. It was about a wide variety of things, games included, but it was really about these parallel digital universes where people could live, where they could work, where they could play, where they could do anything unbound by the rules that exist in the physical world. And these last few years have been focused on gaming, primarily because virtual reality is built on games industry technology, game engines, game assets, many games being directly adapted into virtual reality. And these other industries where we're talking about education and simulation, it's not that they don't want to use virtual reality, it's that it's taking time for them to catch up and to learn how to use these game industry tools to use virtual reality for what they're doing. In the next few years, virtual reality is going to be necessarily limited. We talked about this earlier. really need a pretty high-end PC to use virtual reality, and you're going to need something that costs something like $1,000 just for the PC. And most people don't have computers with high-end graphics cards, which you really do need for virtual reality right now. In the future, that's going to change. Give it 5 or 6 years, and probably most computers that people own are going to be capable of running good virtual reality experiences. But right now, I think it's going to be this niche just because of the equipment that you're required to have. Now, you could be successful and still be niche. You could still sell many millions of units. One could argue that modern game consoles are niche, even though they're still reaching hundreds of millions of people. Compared to smartphones or television, it's a very small audience. But I think that as virtual reality gets better, as it eventually approaches the quality of real life, almost anyone is going to have a use for this. It's just a matter of having enough content, the quality being high enough, and the cost being low enough.
You think one day VR will be kind of as ubiquitous as, say, like the smartphone?
I think I'm really biased, but I do believe that it's going to be more ubiquitous than the smartphone.
More ubiquitous than the smartphone.
Well, remember that the smartphone is something that we integrate into our daily lives. We all carry it around with us. And eventually, I think that augmented reality and virtual reality technologies are going to converge and combine into the same sets of hardware. If they end up converging into hardware that you either wear all of the time, or at least you carry around with you all of the time, there's no reason to expect that it can't supplant everything we already do with smartphones and add a wide variety of other applications. And so that, I think, would lead to wider spread adoption. And again, this is someday. I'm not talking about the next 5 years, probably not even the next 10 years before virtual reality actually surpasses smartphones. We've got a long run on smartphones left and a lot of other advances going on in mobile computing. But I'd be very surprised if 50 years from now we're all still carrying around little slabs in our pocket that we actually have to take out and use, when instead we can just project virtual information into our environment whenever and however we want.
How about, I've tried many different prototypes. I remember last time I was here, I tried it and I got that feeling where you're almost about to jump off a cliff. They showed me that experience. I'm afraid of heights. I had a minor meltdown. This go around, it was kind of interesting to really interact with someone. It was the first time we were interacting, so that was interesting. My next step was, when are we going to be able to feel? We had feel, touch, smell. Is that happening? Are you guys working on that kind of in the Oculus labs in Menlo Park?
Right, well, so it's Oculus research, and we have a lot, we've actually talked about some of these at our developer conference in September, Oculus Connect. We are working on all those things, on scent, on touch, on all these other aspects of the experience besides vision and audio, which are really the most obvious ones. There's already some basic haptics in Oculus Touch, which allow you to simulate some types of interactions, but it's nowhere close to what we want, which is obviously to be able to do anything that you would do in the real world, in the virtual world, and have it feel exactly the same. It's going to be a long time before I can, really feel this couch and it feels the same. But it is going to happen eventually. There's a lot of promising advances going on right now. But one thing to remember is that virtual reality is going to be able to simulate some set of experiences perfectly long before it can simulate every set of experiences perfectly. Like haptic feedback technology that can simulate fuzzy couches is actually much harder than making something that can simulate, say, driving a car or using a chisel tool or using a paintbrush. Those are all much easier to accomplish. And we're going to see those before we see some of the harder problems.
What do you think you're going to be able to simulate perfectly?
I'd argue we're able to simulate some things perfectly already.
Like what?
Well, if I wanted to simulate using like a gamepad with rumble motors in it, that we can already do that. You just give them a gamepad. But like if you wanted to simulate, for example, a chisel or a pencil, or like a pencil's pretty easy actually. A pencil where it's something where you put it up against a surface and you just you're just moving across a linear 2D surface and getting that pressure feedback. That would be one of the easier things to simulate in the grand scheme of haptics.
So let's say with haptics, at some point we can see and feel and touch and smell. With virtual reality. Go wherever you want with this, but how will Oculus change our relationships or physical intimacy?
So, I don't know 100%, but I can make guesses.
Let's try.
If we look at what our relationships are built around today, a lot of it is around digital technology. It's around things like email, text messages, Instagram, Facebook. Like we were just posing for a picture, probably for Twitter, right?
Right.
And that's a part of our relationship. Your relationship with your followers, my relationship with the people that I talk to. Sharing pictures and moments with each other. The problem is that most forms of digital communication today are pretty limited compared to real life. That's why we drag people all to the same place so that we can meet face to face and talk to each other. It's because we get something we can't currently get any other way. But if you have virtual reality that's perfect, or not even perfect, but kind of good enough in many areas, you can start to have people communicate digitally in a much more human way, to actually feel like they're face to face with a person, even though they're all on different continents. To have people sharing an experience that's actually a real 3D, 360 recreation of something that actually happened, whether it's a wedding or a presidential debate or something else, rather than just a little snapshot or a picture. If we look back a few decades, we have lots of black and white photos that are the only record of many events in history. And we look back and we say, wow, that's really incredible that we don't have any videos, we don't even have color photos of a lot of this stuff. And all we have are these very limited little black and white pictures. I think that, video recordings of what we're talking about today are going to feel similarly limited in a few decades. I wouldn't be surprised if in 20 or 30 years people look back at the 2000s and 2000 teens and say, wow, can you believe that the only way they had to share experiences were teeny tiny little cropped rectangles and pictures of things that actually went on? Once you're able to share an entire experience captured as it actually happened, people are going to adopt that.
Not to get kind of philosophical about it, but even when we were back there playing with this game, and I was like shooting a gun, and it was so easy, and it was really fun, to be honest. My first thought was, oh my God, are kids going to be like shooting these guns in these virtual reality worlds, and it's going to make it seem fun and easier to kind of promote violence? So how do you? I guess kind of the question is, do you worry that people might blur, the younger people using this might blur the lines between what's real and what's not, and blowing up fireworks in the virtual world and blowing up fireworks in the real world?
Well, there's no violence in Toy Box, and many people would agree, even people who are anti-gun would agree, shooting guns is fun. People like doing it. Yeah. I'd say that it's really just an evolution of the same thing we've always seen with film, with comic books, with video games. Parents have to make sure they're aware of what their kids are consuming and that it's appropriate for them to consume. I don't think that people who play Need for Speed necessarily become street racers. I don't think that people who play Call of Duty necessarily become soldiers or terrorists or anything else. I think that there's a distinction between fantasy and the real world, and that's going to continue to exist even as media gets more and more advanced.
But even if those worlds get closer and closer together with what you guys are doing.
Well, I mean, if you look at Hollywood, really, they've done a really incredible job of moving to where they're able to depict things in a very realistic fashion. And if you look at the latest video games, I think that they also have some really incredible graphics, incredible campaign, incredible stories. I don't think that necessarily taking the step from using a gamepad to holding a motion controller, or even using your own hands with advanced haptic feedback technology, none of that is going to change the fundamental issue, which is that there's some type of content that kids shouldn't be using, and that's probably not going to change.
Let's talk Hollywood. You guys kind of have a studio where you're building out, showing how you can use Oculus for storytelling. How have you found Hollywood has reacted? I know there have been mixed reactions. I know James Cameron said something about how he thought it was a yawn, so let's pretend he's sitting right here. What would you say to him?
I think technology's come a long way and that he may have a different opinion, but I can't speak for him. What I can say is that a lot of other filmmakers, I won't name drop because I hate it when people do that, it makes you look desperate, but there are a lot of people who are interested in virtual reality and are interested in how it can be used to tell stories better. We have internally at Oculus something called Oculus Story Studio, which is working on lots of very different types of short stories in virtual reality, and we're open sourcing a lot of what we learn. So we put out a lot of the code, a lot of the assets. We've been doing technical blogs on how we accomplish certain things, problems we ran into, because we didn't do everything perfectly. And that's because we want people to learn from what we're doing and try to not have to learn everything the hard way themselves. Because telling stories in virtual reality is very different from telling stories through traditional film or even through video games. And it's going to be a long time before virtual reality storytelling is nearly as advanced as film, which has had many decades to really refine itself. But I think it's a tool for empathy in storytelling, to make you really feel like a character is real, to make it feel like you're really there with them, to make you understand what's going on in a way you can't do with other technology. That's the real potential of virtual reality.
Not everyone has the opportunity to say, I've got this cool new technology I'm testing out, and then have like Mark Zuckerberg come over and be like, I'm going to try out your technology. What was that like, having Mark Zuckerberg kind of, in your studios testing out your technology?
I mean, we had lots of people try the technology.
Yeah.
not to belittle Mark or anything, but like we've had lots of important people come over the years to try VR, and he was one of many people. So when he first came in, it wasn't like that was a truly astounding, mind-blowing event.
What's he like as a boss?
I mean, he's not necessarily directly serving as my boss in the way that most people would traditionally think about it. We've mostly been. When we came together with Facebook, one of the reasons that it worked out so well is because we had a really similar vision for the future of virtual reality. It wasn't like they were coming in to impose their will on us. When we first started talking, it wasn't about an acquisition at all. It was about ways that we could potentially work together on virtual reality. And it became clear, who a voice crack there? It became increasingly clear that they wanted to do a lot of the things that we wanted to do. And then in fact, if we were both going to work on virtual reality, we were going to end up competing in a lot of ways, especially as we move towards this idea of a metaverse, a digital world that exists parallel to our own. Some people ask, like, do they let you do your own thing? And it's like, well, we both kind of wanted to do the same thing, so we're both on the same page.
So what does that world look like, that ultimate world that you kind of envision? And you've talked about a little bit like the Matrix before and what you think it will, what this could look like, what this won't look like. What do you believe, like putting on your dreamer hat a little bit, that this could look like?
It's not going to look like any of the sci-fi depictions of it. A lot of people have this idea that it's going to be just like the Matrix or just like Snow Crash or something else. I think that the reality is that technology evolves in ways that nobody can predict. And I would probably be wrong if I sat here and said, oh, this is what it's going to look like in 20 years. I'm almost certainly going to be wrong. So I'm not even going to try to pretend that I know exactly how things are going to develop. What I do know is going to happen is that virtual worlds will increase in significance and importance, especially as virtual reality and augmented reality combine and converge to the point where you have digital worlds and digital worlds and physical worlds that coexist and are able to share things back and forth between them. I think that it's going to change the way that we look at what's real and what isn't, because right now there's this big distinction between what's real and what isn't, based mostly on value and how easy it is to interact with. Interacting with something digitally is very, very different from interacting with something that's actually physically in existence. If virtual reality advances enough, that line might blur a lot to where there's a lot of things that exist in the virtual world that feel a lot more physical than a lot of the things in the real world.
Do you have like any specific example of that?
Sure. Like one example would be when you have people who are going to be able to, one example is like collaborating and on designing things in a virtual space. In the real world, you're actually pretty limited on what you can do. If you bring a bunch of people all to the same office, which might require actually flying them on planes all to come together, you could, let's say, look at a part that we're using in the Rift, like some plastic piece. In the real world, we're going to look at this part. We might have the model up on one of our screens. We can make little modifications. If we really want to be cool, we have a 3D printer that we're able to have printing stuff, and it takes a couple hours, and then it comes out, and we can fiddle with it in our hands again. But with virtual reality, you have the potential to, first of all, bring all of these people into the same virtual world, even though they're all across the real world. And once you put them in this world, you can have them look at that same part digitally and pass it around, except rather than having one piece, you could multiply it into 20, and everybody gets their own piece. You can actually modify it in real time, rather than having to wait for it to be physically reproduced in the real world. And to me, at that point, you end up with a digital world that is almost certainly more useful than the real world. I mean, if we were able to perfectly simulate all the good things of the real world, like having good enough haptics, having good enough models, having good enough graphics, then all you're left with is benefits, really. Being able to multiply objects, to modify objects, to infinitely create things without actually having to expend real-world resources and time. That's not something that most people are really thinking about.
And I've got to wrap it up, but last question.
I'll just go into one more thing. A
Yeah.
lot of people have talked, we won't go into it too much, a lot of people have talked about this idea of a post-scarcity economy, and virtual reality is potentially our best shot at a real post-scarcity economy. It's one thing to try to say that everybody in the world can have everything physically, even though it takes vast resources physically to create. It's much easier to make the bet that everyone will be able to have everything in virtual reality without significant economic cost.
That's interesting.
Well, I mean, it's kind of an extension of what we talked about earlier with education. If you have an experience, like, people could say, oh, but visiting France virtually will never be the same as visiting Paris in the real world. And I would reply, say, well, it might not be the same. It might not even be quite as good. But that's kind of a silly argument. It'd be like somebody saying, well, You haven't driven a real car until you've driven a Ferrari. It might be true, but the vast majority of people are never going to drive one, and it's not even necessarily the best car out there. What matters a lot more is what everybody is able to experience. And so even if visiting Paris for real ends up being something that's better, it's not something that all 8 billion, 9 billion, 10 billion people in the world are going to be able to do. Virtual reality makes that experience accessible to everyone.
And last question, you are so obsessed with this idea of virtual reality. You've been working on this for years and years since you were basically a kid. What do you love about it? Why are you so obsessed with it?
It's simple. Virtual reality is a science fiction technology. It's right up there with artificial intelligence and space travel and time travel and robots and flying cars. It's one of these ultimate technologies that can do anything, that would allow you to do anything. And to be able to work on that and have it actually becoming real is one of the best things I can imagine working on. So it's really easy to be excited about a technology that will allow you to experience anything, to do anything, and to be its own set of experiences, in addition to being able to simulate every other type of media we've ever had. I'm not saying that that's going to happen perfectly today or tomorrow or next year, but within my lifetime, we're going to have perfect virtual reality, and that's the most interesting thing I can imagine working on.
Great. Thank you. Cool.
Thank you.
All right. All right, I think we had this.